Hi and welcome. I am Kat Eggers. Today's Dharma talk will be discussing the power of practice. So first of all, the bad news is that whatever you're practicing already, whether it's on purpose or it's an unconscious habit, is your practice. We can't get out of having a practice. And all of those practices create a momentum. They have corresponding neural pathways. I like to think of the momentum of a practice as kind of like a stream, and there are currents in the stream that if you step in will pull you along. So the bad news is you already have those, whether you realize it or not, but the good news is you can always start right now with new practices that you set with intention. If we're talking about our yoga practice or a mindfulness or a meditation practice, new practices can become habits. They can take on a momentum where as you practice more and more, it becomes almost like second nature. So for instance, in my own life, I experienced a back injury, a low back injury, about 4 years ago that had me in bed, unable to move for about a week. It was incredibly painful, and it taught me a lot about the habits that I had in my body that had led me to that back injury. Over time, I had to learn a whole set of new habits of being in my body. And at first, it was really challenging to be in my body in a whole different way, to be paying attention all the time through all my daily activities to how I was moving. After some time, it only took about 6 months of tracking how I was showing up in my body every day, that those new habits became how I moved. One of the beautiful things about establishing a practice, especially if it's a yoga practice, mindfulness, or meditation practice, is your practice will change you. And the beauty of it is that you have no idea where it will take you. You have no idea what it will feel like to be in this new space that unfolds as you progress on your path. Committing to a practice and continuing to show up to it, even though you don't know where it's going, you don't know what you will become, helps us to practice acceptance and surrender and living with uncertainty. When we let go of this sense that I need to know who I am, then we can actually relax back into the support of something deeper, more fundamental, our own higher self, even. So that brings us to one of the challenges of setting up and establishing a new practice, is that often the new practice will bump up against our old practice, our old habitual practices. And often we can get kind of waylaid, and maybe our new practice, let's say it's I want to show up on my yoga mat every day at 9 a.m. for at least 15 minutes. And maybe you start to feel like there's something in your way, you're not finding it, it's not happening, you're not showing up. You're finding it hard to get the motivation. You did it really strongly for 10 days, and then you're starting to kind of trail off, and maybe now it's once or twice a week. Often what's happening when we feel like it's really hard to establish this new practice is we're actually having a hard time letting go of whatever this old habitual practice is. And often that habitual practice is wrapped up in a story. And you can think of these Unconscious stories that we tell ourselves is like a knot. It's like a little knot that's tied up in our psyche. And we actually have to do the work of untying that knot, loosening it up, and allowing the knot to actually untie in order for this new practice to have enough space and enough ground to get hold. So starting a new practice can be a great doorway into understanding ourselves a lot better. So going back to my own experience, I came up against this story of how I was in my body. And it was extremely humbling because I had always thought of myself as this incredible athlete, that I was invincible in my body and I could do everything. And to learn that the ways I was being in my body were actually leading through repetitive motion towards injury was shocking to me. So I had to let go of this old story of being the super athlete and why that was so important to me. I had to look at this deeper story of not enoughness and rewrite the story to allow more space, more acceptance for being different ways in order to establish a new practice and really let that new practice gain hold. So I invite you to think about establishing a practice as a tool for self-discovery, to be open to bumping up against what feels like maybe an obstacle and getting curious about that obstacle. I invite you to look at your practice as an adventure. You don't know where it's going to go, to allow whoever your true self is to unfold without imposing ideas from your mind onto yourself. I think it's also really important to be kind. Often when we want to establish a new practice, like let's say a meditation practice, a yoga practice, we have expectations, we have a goal. When we don't meet that goal, the inner critic can often jump forward. Often we end up giving ourselves a really hard time. So be kind to yourself, because even just a little bit of practice every day is still practice. You're still showing up. So does it need to be 1.5 hours of yoga 5 to 6 days a week? That could be a goal ultimately, but it's also just as much of a practice to show up 3 days a week for 15 minutes. So give yourself permission to start small. You don't need to fly to the moon here. The last thing I want to say is nothing changes without practice. There really is no quick fix. There's no silver bullet. In order to truly change and become more fully who we are, it requires us to establish practices with intention and to commit to those practices. Next week, we'll be talking about how to set intention, the power of setting intention, and how that can help us to stay committed to our practice. Thank you for joining me for this Dharma talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. Namaste.